Let's begin with the truth most people overlook. When dealing with an avoidant partner, they're not afraid of intimacy, they're afraid of enmeshment. There's a difference, and it's not just semantic. The avoidant doesn't recoil from closeness because they're cold or incapable of love. In fact, many of them crave connection deeply. But what terrifies them is the loss of self that, in their subconscious mind, often comes packaged with emotional intimacy. They equate closeness with engulfment, not out of logic, but from emotional memory. You can't solve this by offering more love, louder declarations, or tighter embraces. That only deepens the root fear. The avoidance nervous system has been trained, often since childhood, to equate emotional dependency with danger. Maybe they had to grow up too fast, parent to parent, or survive in an environment where their needs were ignored. Over time, they learned a fundamental rule: don't need too much, don't get too close, and most of all, don't rely on anyone. That's the armor. That's the story they've told themselves to stay safe. And if you don't understand that, you'll take their distance personally and react from your own wounds. You'll start chasing. You'll start demanding. And then, ironically, you become the very force they feel the need to escape. But what if you did the opposite? What if, instead of interpreting their withdrawal as rejection, you saw it as a defensive reflex, like a flinch before a blow that never came? What if you chose, in that moment, not to react, but to hold steady, not out of indifference, but out of insight? That's where real influence begins. When you understand the avoidance core fear is being consumed or controlled, you stop trying to prove your love through closeness. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop pushing them to emote, to declare, to commit. Instead, you create space, not cold space, but respectful, open space. And in that space, something remarkable happens. They begin to feel safe, not because you convinced them, but because you didn't crowd them. You didn't demand they hand over their independence as the price of connection. This is the strategy most people miss. They try to win the avoidance heart through intensity, by being more emotional, more expressive, more persistent. But the avoidant isn't moved by intensity, they're moved by stability, by subtlety, by someone who doesn't need them to change in order to feel loved, someone who doesn't need to be needed. That's what earns their trust. And once you have their trust, the dynamic flips. Now they begin to come forward, not out of fear of loss, but out of genuine desire. They move toward you because your presence doesn't feel like a trap. Your love doesn't feel like a burden. They begin to associate intimacy with freedom, a radical shift that rewires everything they thought they knew about connection. So if you want the avoidant to stop pulling away, stop pulling on them. Stop yanking at the threads of their silence. Instead, hold steady in your own center. Become the calm, grounded force they never knew they could rely on. Show them, not through words, but through consistency, that intimacy doesn't have to mean invasion. And remember, the avoidant isn't resisting you. They're resisting the idea that love means surrendering their identity. But when you become someone who respects that identity, who doesn't try to blur into them or demand they blur into you, commitment stops feeling like a loss. It starts to feel like home. The avoidant stays not when they're convinced, but when they're safe. Be the safety. Everything changes from there. The moment an avoidant begins to pull away, most people react in exactly the way that guarantees further distance. They chase, not always physically, but emotionally, through texts, through questions, through the subtle tightening of tone and tension. It doesn't matter whether you express it with words or silence. If your energy starts grasping, the avoidance nervous system reads it as pressure, and pressure is the avoidant's ultimate enemy. The pursue-withdraw cycle begins, and the more you pursue, the more they withdraw. It's not a reflection of how much they care. It's a reflection of how much they fear being consumed. You can't out-talk this pattern. You can't out-reassure it. Because the more emotionally urgent you become, the more they feel like they're being dragged into someone else's emotional landscape. And for the avoidant, someone who equates closeness with emotional suffocation, that's intolerable. It reminds them of a time when they had to suppress their own needs to meet the needs of others. So they retreat, not to hurt you, but to breathe. Here's the psychological key most people miss. The avoidant doesn't fear closeness itself. They fear being swallowed whole. And when you start chasing them in an emotional panic, you unknowingly reinforce the very story they're trying to escape. The story that says love means pressure, obligation, intrusion. So the real power move isn't to run after them. It's to disarm the dynamic completely. Step out of the game. Drop the emotional tug of war. You don't do this by pretending not to care. That's avoidance in disguise. You do it by remaining emotionally regulated, grounded, and present without demanding. You stay connected to yourself first. You anchor your nervous system. Because if you lose yourself when they pull back, they don't see your love. They see your instability. And that instability triggers a survival instinct they've been fine tuning their whole lives get out before you lose yourself. Avoidants are hypersensitive to unspoken emotional demands. You don't even have to say anything. They can feel it. They can feel when your gaze starts to carry expectation, when your silence becomes heavy, when your presence becomes less about being and more about trying to extract closeness. So you have to become something radically different, someone who doesn't collapse in the face of emotional ambiguity, someone who can hold tension without turning it into chaos. If you want the avoidant to come forward, you have to stop forcing them to. You need to stop turning every moment of disconnection into a crisis. And that requires something most people are not willing to practice: emotional leadership, not control, not manipulation, but leadership, the ability to lead yourself through discomfort without using the other person's response to regulate your own worth. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the cycle. And in that stillness, something shifts. The avoidant starts to notice something unfamiliar: space that isn't cold, presence that isn't clinging, and connection that doesn't demand. That's when they begin to re-evaluate their instinct to withdraw. Because now, withdrawal doesn't give them more freedom. It isolates them from a connection that actually respects their boundaries. You become the exception, the one they don't need to run from, and not because you convinced them, but because you didn't collapse when they disappeared. You didn't chase, beg, or punish. You simply held your position calmly and confidently and let them return on their own terms, which they will if what they're returning to feels like freedom, not a trap. The one who stops chasing doesn't lose the avoidant. They become the only person the avoidant feels safe enough to come home to. There's a crucial distinction you have to learn if you want an avoidant to commit. And stay committed. Mirroring their need for autonomy does not mean withholding love. This is where most people fail. They confuse respect for space with emotional distance. They think, if I pull back too, maybe they'll miss me. But that's not mirroring. That's retaliation in disguise. And it only reinforces the avoidant's core belief that connection always comes with conditions, expectations, and subtle punishments for needing space. You don't win an avoidant's heart by withdrawing your warmth. You win it by showing that love doesn't require either of you to disappear. And to do that, you have to model something they've likely never experienced: emotional availability that isn't invasive, intimacy that isn't demanding, presence that doesn't pressure. That's what most people fail to understand. They treat the avoidant's independence like a wall to tear down, rather than a language to speak. But autonomy isn't the enemy of connection. It's the foundation of sustainable connection. And if you can hold your own sense of self while offering warmth, you become the first person in their life who doesn't treat closeness like a contract that cancels out individuality. Avoidants aren't afraid of you. They're afraid of losing themselves theirs in you. So when you show them, day by day, that you can stay connected without collapsing into need, that you can be loving without being invasive, that you can stay grounded in your own identity without demanding they carry the weight of it, something changes. Their nervous system stops bracing. Their subconscious starts rewriting the story. You become a place of safety, not because you're passive, but because you're sovereign. This is the paradox most people never master. You need to be consistent without being controlling. You need to be emotionally expressive without expecting reciprocity on your timeline. You need to create a rhythm of connection that breathes. Like a tide, not a trap. Avoidants fear being cornered, so never try to contain them. That doesn't mean you don't have standards. It doesn't mean you accept breadcrumbs or tolerate emotional neglect. It means you lead by example. You demonstrate what mature interdependence looks like, where both people are free to be fully themselves and still deeply connected. That's a relationship worth staying in. That's the kind of bond that doesn't just survive time. It earns devotion. You need to stop thinking in terms of control and start thinking in terms of alignment. If they pull back, you don't match their distance by going cold. You hold your emotional posture with grace. You stay warm, available, and composed, not to manipulate them, but to affirm that love isn't a game of power. You're not there to win. You're there to relate. And if they begin to associate that presence with peace, not pressure, you've already changed the game. Avoidants aren't used to love feeling like freedom. That's why they pull away. They've only known connection through the lens of responsibility, guilt, or suffocation. So your job isn't to convince them. It's to become a living example of something they didn't know existed, a relationship that honors both connection and individuality. That's when they start leaning in, not to escape themselves, but to experience more of who they are as with you. Don't punish the avoidant for protecting their independence. Instead, become the one person who proves they never had to choose between love and freedom. That's the kind of presence they won't walk away from, because it's not just rare, it's irreplaceable. If you want to reach an avoidant on a level that changes the relationship, not just temporarily, but permanently, you have to stop trying to convince them with words alone. Logic won't get you there. Reassurance won't get you there. Even emotional declarations, no matter how sincere, often fall flat, because the avoidant doesn't trust a language the way you do. They've learned to rely on control, distance, and independence as safety measures. And words often meant pressure. Promises meant expectation. Emotion meant entrapment. So if you're just talking, explaining, asking, even pleading, you're likely speaking to the wrong part of them. To truly shift an avoidance instinct to retreat, you have to speak directly to their nervous system, not their intellect, not their inner child, their nervous system. You have to become the kind of presence that regulates rather than destabilizes. Because when the avoidant feels safe in their body around you, not just safe in thought, but in sensation, everything else begins to shift. This is where most people misunderstand emotional intimacy. They think connection happens through conversation. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, connection is registered somatically first. That means the avoidant reads your energy before they process your words, your tone before your message, your pacing, your volume, your posture. All of these speak louder to their subconscious than any carefully chosen sentence. If you approach an avoidant from a place of urgency, your voice might be soft, but your energy screams. If you approach them with a hidden agenda, even if it's just your own unspoken need for comfort, they feel it. Not because they're cold, but because they've been trained to scan for it. Their body remembers what it's like to be emotionally ambushed, guilt-tripped, or needed more than they could safely handle. So even subtle pressure, the kind you're not even aware you're transmitting, can trigger their retreat. So what do? You regulate yourself first. You learn to speak in the language of safety. That means emotional steadiness. That means breathing slower, speaking less, holding eye contact not as a demand, but as an invitation. It means you stop trying to get something and start simply being something. Steady, present, non-intrusive. You begin showing them, through the smallest cues, that you're not a threat. You're not going to flood them with feelings they're not ready to hold. You're not going to fall apart if they need space. You're not going to make them responsible for your regulation. You're the calm they never had. You're the nervous system that doesn't require theirs to adapt. And in that environment, their defenses begin to soften. Not because they've been convinced, but because their body finally stops bracing. That's when trust begins to form. Not when they agree to a label, not when they text more, but when their body feels safe near yours. That's when emotional availability begins to emerge. Because now, closeness no longer equals overwhelm. Love no longer equals danger. You've rewritten the terms without saying a word. And that's the deepest influence you can ever have. Not by pushing harder, not by asking them to feel more, but by embodying what safety feels like. Most people try to explain safety. The rare few become it. Be that person. The avoidant doesn't need you to speak louder. They need to feel you're not a threat. Regulate yourself, and you'll reach them in the only place that ever mattered, the part of them that never learned how to feel safe in closeness. Until now. If you try to get an avoidant to commit, you've already lost. Not because they don't want to be with you, but because they can feel the weight of your intention, the pressure behind your words, the agenda beneath your affection. And that pressure, even if subtle, even if wrapped in love, activates the same survival instinct every avoidant has trained themselves to obey, protect autonomy at all costs. It's not about your desire. It's about how your desire is delivered. When the energy behind your connection is about convincing, steering, proving, or pulling, the avoidant will read it as a threat. Not consciously necessarily, but viscerally. They'll feel themselves becoming the object of your need rather than the subject of their own choice. And nothing triggers withdrawal faster than the sense that their freedom is being negotiated away in the name of love. The deeper truth is this: avoidants don't respond to control. They respond to trust. Not the kind you declare, the kind you demonstrate through your self-possession, your emotional containment, your ability to invite rather than insist. And that distinction between an invitation and a demand is everything. Most people approach relationships like a negotiation. They set timelines, expectations, standards, and beneath all of it is the belief that love is something to be earned, secured, or extracted. But when you relate to an avoidant this way, you become just another source of pressure. Just another person who says, "I love you," but really means, "Now give me what I want." And they will feel that long before they articulate it. What works is subtle. What works is rooted in strength, not strategy. You replace control with clarity. You make your desires known. But you're unattached to the outcome. You don't manipulate. You don't maneuver. You lead. You lead by being emotionally sovereign, by holding standards without force, by being so grounded in your own worth that the avoidant is not coerced into commitment. They're inspired into it. Because here's what few understand: the avoidant doesn't commit when they feel chased. They commit when they feel free as and seen. And most importantly, when they feel like they're at choosing, not surrendering. When your connection feels like a container where they can expand, not contract, they begin to come forward naturally, not out of obligation, not out of fear of losing you, but because your presence feels like an invitation to become more of themselves, not less. You create that kind of space by mastering one thing: your relationship with your own nervous system. That's what allows you to hold your desire without collapsing into need. That's what allows you to say what you want without grasping for it. That's what gives your invitation power, because it's rooted in calm authority, not anxious pursuit. You show them moment by moment that they are free, and in that freedom, something sacred happens. They begin to trust you, not because you demanded it, but because you never made their autonomy the price of your affection. You became the one person they could get close to first, without having to let go of themselves. That's what makes commitment feel safe. That's what transforms connection from pressure into possibility. So stop asking them to choose you. Become someone whose presence makes choosing you feel effortless. Because when love feels like liberation, even the most avoidant will lean in, not to escape themselves, but to find more of who they are with you. That's not control. That's real influence. And it's the only kind that lasts. The final shift, the one that makes all the difference, is not about getting the avoidant to change. It's about you becoming someone they no longer need to pull away from. The truth is, you can't make anyone commit. What you can do is become the kind of person who renders withdrawal irrelevant, the kind of presence that doesn't provoke their defenses, but dissolves the need for them altogether. That's what it means to become a secure anchor. Most people approach relationships trying to manage the other person's behavior. They watch for signs of distance. They brace for withdrawal. They overanalyze text. But in doing so, they abandon the one thing that would actually shift the dynamic, their own internal stability. You don't need to micromanage the avoidance response. You need to master your own regulation. Because the avoidant doesn't pull away from love. They pull away from instability, from emotional neediness, from energy that says, "I need you to be something in order for me to be okay." When you can stay rooted in your own emotional center, when you no longer panic when they distance, no longer chase when they retreat, no longer shift your identity based on their approval, you become rare, not because you're playing hard to get, but because you're actually hard to unnerve. That's what earns their respect. That's what earns their trust. And more importantly, that's what earns their desire to stay. An avoidant doesn't want to be responsible for your emotions. They don't want to carry the burden of your identity. And the moment they sense that you've outsourced your self-worth to the relationship, they feel trapped. So they do what they've always done to survive. They step back, not to punish you, but to preserve themselves. Now, imagine the opposite. Imagine you're the one person in their life who doesn't require them to perform, who doesn't panic when they're quiet, who doesn't punish them for needing space, who doesn't collapse the second things feel uncertain. You remain present, self-contained, emotionally available, yet not emotionally dependent. You don't threaten their autonomy. You enhance it. And paradoxically, that's what makes commitment feel safe. Not because they feel forced, but because they feel free in your presence. That's what a secure anchor is. Not someone who clings, not someone who dominates, but someone who is sovereign, someone who can feel deeply without becoming unstable, someone who knows that their peace isn't dependent on someone else's proximity. The moment you become that person, you stop asking, why are they pulling away? Because they aren't. There's nothing to pull away from. You're no longer a source of pressure. You're a source of peace. This is the moment when the avoidant begins to open, not because you demanded it, but because you didn't. You allowed them to choose you rather than fear being cornered by you. And that choice, when it comes from freedom, is the only kind that lasts. So the goal isn't to control the avoidant. The goal is to become unshakable in your own emotional foundation. To become someone who doesn't chase, doesn't shrink, doesn't perform, but simply is. The more stable you are in your presence, the more magnetic you become. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Because the avoidant doesn't stay with the person who tries the hardest. They stay with the one who makes leaving unnecessary. Be that, and there will be nothing left to run from.